And I want to welcome everyone tonight to this community conversation. Thank you for choosing to be here. This is my fourth community conversation, and it's on a topic, early education and care, that is both professionally and personally incredibly important to me, like so many of you. Our conversation today is incredibly timely. We're seeing significant attention on this topic in both our federal and state governments. Just this afternoon, I got an alert on my phone about another informative Glow piece on the childcare system in Massachusetts. I'm State Representative Kate Lipper-Garabedian. I'm a former 7th grade public school teacher, an education attorney, including for more than 5 years at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Education, and most importantly, a mom to 2 boys, ages 3 and 8. As I shared in the pre-meeting, there's a decent chance one of them will make an impromptu, unscripted appearance because that always seems to happen these days. I'm very humbled to be your host and moderator for today's well-timed discussion. The Community Conversation series is an opportunity to bring together diverse people in diverse spaces. I want to acknowledge my constituents watching the event, as well as those joining from outside the district. We are all fortunate to have with us an extraordinary panel of speakers to guide us through an examination of the cross-sector dimensions of early education and care. I'm glad to make space to focus on advancing program accessibility and affordability, an agency for families and providers, while inspiring our community to take committed action towards solutions across the Commonwealth. So with that, I'm really excited to review our time together today. I'm going to start by introducing our accomplished panel, and then we're pleased to have remarks pre-recorded by Congresswoman Katherine Clark. After a few additional framing thoughts, I'll transition over to our panelists to discuss the opportunities and challenges of early education and care, and we can close with some next steps. So with that, let me start out by elevating the work and leadership of our 4 accomplished panelists. So Amy O'Leary is the Executive Director of Strategies for Children, an advocacy and policy organization that works to ensure that Massachusetts invests the resources needed for all children from birth to age 5 to access high quality early education and care programs. Amy manages the overall advocacy and policy strategy, legislative and field engagement, strategic partnerships, and fundraising. Throughout COVID-19, she has led support efforts, including hosting a daily 9:30 call that I was excited to attend, I think just last week, for the early education and care field. Sharon Scott-Chandler is the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at Action for Boston Community Development, ABCD, playing a key role in overseeing ABCD's wide array of human services programs. She has provided leadership to the $30 million ABCD Head Start program, serving low-income preschool children and their families in 24 centers throughout Boston's neighborhoods. In 2017, Governor Baker appointed Sharon to the Black Advisory Commission, which advises on issues related to the economic prosperity and well-being of Massachusetts's Black community. And from 2007 to 2010, Governor Patrick appointed her chair of the board of the Massachusetts Early Education and Care Department. Kathleen Walsh is the president and CEO of the YMCA Metro North. The YMCA of Metro North provides youth development programs for more than 6,000 children each year. Its Y Academy programs in Lynn, here in Melrose, Peabody, Saugus, and Stoneham serve as one of the largest providers of early learning and childcare in the region. And finally, a former commissioner of early education and care, Tom Weber is the executive director of the Massachusetts Business Coalition for Early Childhood Education, a growing coalition of CEOs and business leaders focused on early childcare and education. Tom leads the coalition to advocate for policies and programs that make early childcare and education more readily available to Massachusetts workers, and to collaborate around employer best practices for supporting early childhood needs and advancing equitable childcare solutions. Very excited to hear from each of you tonight. Before we do that and transition to our discussion, I'm pleased to share some opening remarks from my friend, my constituent as I am hers, and the Assistant Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Congresswoman Katherine Clark, who has been tirelessly championing efforts to expand and support early education. Do you all hear it? I do not hear it. We can read it if we need to. Pause just for a second.
Diana, before you share the screen, on the left, there's a little box to share the audio.
Thrilled to be joining you for this important discussion about our shared fight for quality, accessible early education. Thank you to my friend, Representative Lipper-Garabedian, for bringing us together for this conversation, and to our incredible panel for your expertise and insight. We face historic challenges within the care economy, but we are also closer than ever to making our goal of early education for all a reality for all. We know that the care economy has long been undervalued and underinvested in. It's time for a paradigm shift. We must finally recognize childcare as an essential part of our economic infrastructure, as a public good. This is why I am working every day to bring President Biden's Build Back Better agenda to life. This transformational package includes universal pre-K, historic investment in childcare and childcare facilities, and a living wage for our early educators. We created the Build Back Better agenda by listening to families, providers, to you, and we know that the care agenda can't wait. I commit this to you. I'm not leaving our youngest Americans behind as we work to recover and rebuild. There's still work to be done to get this over the finish line, but we will make sure that we do the most good for the most people. That's our promise. As I continue my work in Washington, I ask you to keep up the momentum here at home. It's gatherings like this that keep the conversation alive in Washington. Keep telling your stories about how the child care crisis is impacting our communities and why it is so urgent that we make these investments in families and our early education workforce. I'm so grateful for all your work and leadership. Together, we will build back better. Thank you. Hi.
Okay. So as Congresswoman Clark notes, it's now time to think about undoing the undervaluing of the care economy, with particular attention on our early education and childcare settings. The status quo nationwide is simply untenable, and that's egregiously so in Massachusetts. It's true financially. We know that working families are paying twice as much on childcare as their mortgages. And except for Washington, D.C., Massachusetts has the highest childcare costs in the nation, averaging nearly $21,000, or about $1,743 per month. The status quo is also untenable when it comes to access. As we'll discuss, recruiting, honoring, and retaining the EEC workforce is a real challenge, which is limiting access for families across the Commonwealth. Reported again in the Globe this afternoon, Massachusetts has had the weakest rebound in the childcare workforce from pre-COVID levels. This means that families have even more limited options for the care of their young children. So a number of factors make childcare costly in our state. That includes our high cost of living, our higher wages required for labor. The pandemic has also highlighted this boundary in the American education system that separates K-12 teachers from many childcare professionals when it comes to pay, job protections, and respect in the field. It is also a disparity that's really rooted in race, class, and gender. So more than 90% of our childcare professionals are female, more than a third are people of color. And when you compare the workforce to public school teachers in the K-12 system, our early educators and professionals are more likely to be immigrants and from lower income households. And I want to pause here just for a minute to recognize the tremendous sacrifice that so many of our childcare professionals undertook over these last 19 months. You stood up emergency childcare programs. You continue to come to work every day to support our frontline workers, our working families during a pandemic that has claimed the lives of more than 730,000 Americans. You're true heroes for our community. So those are some of the challenges. And unlike most developed nations, the United States has not committed significant public investment into the care of our youngest children, but that could change. And we're hearing from our Assistant Speaker of the House that very well may have strong advocacy at the federal level. So we could strive to prioritize early education care and our professionals as a public good, as critical infrastructure that allows our communities to thrive. As I'm expecting all the panels to discuss, we have policymakers focusing across the EEC space in significant intentional ways. At the state legislature, we've established a commission that is reviewing the cost of childcare and will issue recommendations to the legislature. I was pleased to be an early co-sponsor of that effort. I've also co-sponsored multiple bills in this space, including the Common Start bill, which would increase pay for early education teachers and cut costs for families. At the executive branch level, Massachusetts is one of the very few states that has designated a state department of early education and care. It's a governance model that appropriately elevates the sector. And now EEC is reviewing its regulations to ensure they are responsive and appropriately attuned to the demands and needs of families and providers. And as we've heard from Congresswoman Clark, President Biden's initial Build Back Better Act contains billions in funding for childcare. So I'm going to stop now because I know you're not here really to hear from me. It's really to hear more from the experts. And I'd love for each of you to share a little bit more about yourselves and an overview of how you're responding to this moment in our time and history. So Amy, would you be so kind as to begin?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Representative. And typically when we do these panels, we have to provide all of that context that you just provided. So I thank you for that. I really thank you and Diana for being so attuned to these issues, for having this community conversation, and for folks who are joining us. I think one of the messages we have heard loud and clear from our elected officials is we understand the challenges. And I was with Representative Tucker this morning from Salem. We had Senator Hines on our 9:30 call this morning from Western Mass, and then to be here tonight. I think that the awareness of the realities of what are happening every day in child care centers and family child care programs and public schools it's evident, and I think it's been a result of the pandemic to really see the inequities that have been highlighted. And I think and you have acknowledged the work. We know that there are people who woke up every day thinking about young children and families and how they could help support them over the last 2 years. So we certainly thank them for that. As a former preschool teacher and program director, I also know the tough choices that directors are making every day as they hold their breath to make sure the staff that they have in place can come to work that day. And we also know that directors are covering in classrooms, really trying to maintain the quality that they have, as well as help support staff that is starting. And the other piece you mentioned, I just want to highlight, is the media. Today, the Boston Globe alone had 4 or 5 different stories focused on these issues. So I think, Strategies has been around since 2000, and we spent a lot of time in the early years making the case for the why. And I think now we are at the how. And that's really exciting to think about what that could look like, especially when we think about the federal pieces, the state surplus, and having Commissioner Sam, who I think at the Department of Early Education and Care, who has really thought about how do we take this one-time opportunity with funding and start really building the system that we all have been fighting for decades to best support children and families. I will say one of the benefits of the pandemic was the 9:30 call. So we have about 700 people on our invite list. We get between 60 and 80 folks every single morning to just get on the same page, get accurate information, and think about how we can build power in the early education and care field. These are our experts. These are people who know about child development, how to run organizations, and how to best support children and families. So to connect them directly with elected officials has been one of the most exciting things for me to see happen as educators kind of step into their power and realize how much that they know and how they can influence the decisions that are being made. We've seen both the Department of Early Education and Care and the legislature respond to the feedback they are hearing. And I'm sure we'll get into later about the federal stabilization bills. Now we have any program in Massachusetts that's licensed and was open on March 11th can apply for these flexible funds to support their programs. The one piece I just want to highlight is while we are talking about billions of dollars, we know that this field has been under-resourced for decades. So we are filling in holes that have been built on the low salaries of our early educators. So while this is exciting to think about the funding that might be available, we have to remember that we are paying back and paying forward at the same time. And we need these long-term sustainable plans so that we can do things like build in better compensation for early educators. We can think about health insurance and paid vacation days, many things that people who are doing this work don't have advantages of. And I'll just say one more thing about the stars aligning. You know, you'll hear from the other panelists today how many things we have in place in Massachusetts that we can really start to deliver on the promises that we have made.
Great. Well, the stars are aligning tonight because not only do we have Amy with us, we've also got Sharon, Kathleen, and Tom. So Sharon, do you want to provide some opening remarks as well from your work at ABCD?
Sure. Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Representative, both for having this conversation and prioritizing early ed in the way that you have been, and it's the way that it should be, because it is critical and one of the most important issues of our time. I'm pleased to be here with a bunch of colleagues, both on the panel, and I see a few in the audience who I've worked with and been on this journey, or should I say struggle, for 22 years that I've been at ABCD. And I've had ABCD, for those of you who don't know, is a community action agency serving the greater Boston area, and has done so for the last, since the 1960s. It's rooted in the war on poverty, trying to give people the tools to reach their full potential with programs, serving over 90,000 people each year. Within that, we serve approximately 2,000 a year in 24 early education settings, children 0 to 5 across Boston and the Mystic Valley areas, and another 6,000 families through the Child Care Resource and Referral Program. As I said, I've been doing it 22 years, and when I first came to ABCD, I became the director of Child Care Choices of Boston, which is a child care resource and referral program serving our region. And the perspective, I feel like I've had so many different perspectives on this early ed journey that I figured I would share a little bit about that. And that program is intended to kind of undergird the subsidy system. It's both assisting parents in trying to access, to know about what's high quality care, but also access that care and help pay for it. Also helping and supporting providers in navigating the system of the subsidies, but also in training and understanding their role in the system. I then moved on to Head Start, and we run the largest Head Start program in New England, serving, as I said, 2,000 children. And Head Start is unique because it's federally funded. We have state funded programs as well, but it's directly funded and was targeted back in the 60s, again, another program on from the War on Poverty, to support low income, the most vulnerable children and families with services that would help children catch up to their peers, and providing comprehensive services that involves not only health and well-being, but social emotional supports, family supports, in addition to the cognitive and academic pieces. Another role I've had in this space is, as you mentioned, Representative, Chair of the EEC board. And of course, Tom and I worked very closely together when he was commissioner. And that helped me look at it from a bigger picture perspective. How does the state support all children? And from my perspective, especially those who are part of the subsidy system, but all children across the Commonwealth. Another role or sort of perspective I have in bringing to this conversation, which I'm so glad to have, is as a parent. I am the parent of 3 children, now all teenagers, but when I became chair of the board, I had just come off maternity leave for my 3rd one. So I was sort of the poster child of early childhood education, navigating what to do with my children, where to put them, being a working mom, all of those things kind of really giving me a different lens and a different perspective on the early childhood issues. And then finally, I feel like in all of those, I've come to this from a perspective of advocate, both because of the values that I hold, the mission of the organization, but just understanding that, I believe we all have a responsibility to help children reach their full potential, and especially those whose parents want everything for them and the same thing that we all want for children, but don't have the resources to do it. So I may have gone on a little bit long, but that's where I'm coming from when we begin this conversation, and I just wanted to share that. So I'm so excited to have this conversation. It's been a long journey. I feel like some of the issues we started talking about 20 years ago, we're still grappling with. And so as Amy has said, this is a pivotal moment. None of us could have imagined what was in store for us in March in 2020, both in terms of the health and economic crisis, the racial reckoning, the enhanced crisis in childcare, frankly, and in the early childhood field. And I guess, as Amy mentioned as well, we learned a lot. I think, there were some, you always take a silver lining, and there's some things that we learned, certainly that early childhood education and childcare is pivotal to business, to the economy, to children's development and their everyday life and experiences. We also learned that women continue to bear the brunt of those things, that the challenges of raising children, the challenges of balancing work and life. And so anyway, I'm looking forward to, as Katherine Clark said, the president has, sort of launched or initiated a real national conversation about how we can change that paradigm. But also we need to think, what does that really mean on the ground? And I'm excited to have that conversation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sharon. And it's really inspiring to hear about all the roles that you've played up until this point as well, and how that informs the important work you're doing at ABCD. So really grateful for your time and for you being here. So Kathleen, do you want to talk a little bit about what's going on with YMCA Metro North? And I think we have some slides that we'll share with you.
Sure. I'm not going to review the slides. They can just go as I speak. But first of all, thank you for having me this evening. And, Representative Lipper-Garabedian, we want to thank you for taking the time to visit our childcare sites just maybe a month ago. And you really saw our team in action. I want to thank, Amy and Sharon and Tom too, for letting me join you on this panel. My focus as a CEO really is focused on the whole youth development, healthy living, and social responsibility package in the service areas that that our YMCA are part of. But, one of the things that, I'm really here to represent is all of the Ys in Massachusetts. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but the YMCA is the largest provider of childcare in the state. So hypothetically, take it another step further, we may be the largest employer of childcare staff as well, if the formula holds true. So I'm here really as an advocate. I'm here to thank the childcare workers who tirelessly worked. I can say from my YMCA, aside from the mandated 3-week closing, I think it was about 3 weeks, we opened every single day moving forward. And it was not a decision based on financial gain. It was a decision based on service to the community and commitment to the families. And I think several of the staff team are on here. And yeah, you summed it up earlier on. They are heroes. They are frontline workers that, really are getting the respect that they deserve. And, this staffing crisis is not new. We saw this before the pandemic. It has now been exacerbated by the pandemic. In my role tonight, I really want to talk about the 4 Ps for our organization, and that's pace. We are on the ground. We are moving at the speed of light. And I am hoping that through conversations like this, we can get EEC to move at a quicker pace so that we can really filter down to the troops that need it. I want to talk about product and pricing. our YMCA straddles two regions, which means we have two reimbursement rates. We need to really talk about pricing because it is getting almost impossible to build a break-even budget for a childcare program. I am extraordinarily pleased to pay our staff well. At our YMCA, a lead teacher could get up to $24 an hour. And, when I started in a leadership role with the Y, it may have been $12 or $13 or $14. So we're working progressively to get to that. So the product and the pricing is critically important. And that also comes from long-term commitment from the state. The third thing that I really want to advocate for is a pipeline. And that pipeline needs to be starting with vocational schools, moving on to colleges. I see Kathy Gallo's on this call, moving on to colleges and really coming up with a roadmap to replenish the workforce in childcare settings and make it a valuable career for folks. And then finally, I really think it's important that we talk about planning for the future. We operate on a one-year budget. Most organizations operate, but when we work with the Commonwealth, we're working in 3-month increments, 6-month increments. Maybe we're backdating, maybe we're looking ahead. I would love to get to a point where we can look ahead for 2, 3, 5 years and know what our commitment is, so we can then reinvest it into the community, reinvest it into the staff without putting the organization in any type of financial distress. So, I'm here again to thank everyone who has really advocated for early learning, to say that our YMCA and the YMCAs of Massachusetts are all in terms of improving working conditions, whatever it takes. And again, just to be here, hopefully to talk about the 4 Ps down the road. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. That's really helpful. And it was a joy to get to join you at the Y Academy here in Melrose and be with your professionals and students there as well. So thank you for that invitation earlier this fall. And so Tom, do you want to round us out with some thoughts about sort of the work that you're leading on now and informed by all of the work that you've led on in previous roles? It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Representative. I appreciate it. I'm not surprised to see you hosting this forum, given your commitment to these issues going back probably many, many years, but certainly during your time as General Counsel at the Executive Office of Education, and seeing you carry the mantle of leadership forward into your role as a state leader is consistent with the values that you've always shown. So thank you. And thank you, Diana, for the work that you've done in putting this forum together tonight. And I want to just say thank you to the fellow panelists. You have some real titans of the field. You were talking about somebody complimenting the group. Let me tell you, these are people who really, I've had the pleasure of standing on their shoulders. Their commitment in decades of leadership to the field in early childhood education has been extraordinary. In fact, I think some of the most important chapters of what we have achieved to date really have been written by the folks that you've gathered here today, my fellow panelists. So I just want to applaud their leadership. I have the pleasure right now of leading a group that is newly formed that launched earlier this year, the Massachusetts Business Coalition for Early Childhood Education. This is an initiative that started with Eastern Bank Foundation's resolution that they were going to focus on early childhood development as one of their pillars under an economic inclusion and mobility framework that they were bringing to their philanthropic work. And the first strategy that they undertook was a simple one. They just began to concentrate more of their giving towards early childhood education initiatives. But in surveying the landscape, they had determined that there was a real missing voice in the course of all of this, and it was the business community. And it's not because the business community hasn't been active and engaged in prior early childhood education efforts, but truth be told, really the engagement of the business community has been intermittent and not very well sustained. And so Eastern Bank felt that there was a real opportunity to try to create a forum for the education and engagement of employers, recognizing that early childhood education, while incredibly important to the development of children, is also extraordinarily important to workforce development and economic development. In that, in Massachusetts, our economy was really suffering from a lack of engagement by the employer community in advocating on behalf of early childhood education as a primary enabler of the economy. And so we launched earlier this year, and we've grown to include 81 companies statewide. Collectively, those companies employ over 265 employees in Massachusetts. We also have 19 business associations statewide, chambers of commerce, trade groups who are part of our group. And our vision is to help Massachusetts establish a world-class system of early childhood education. And we define a world-class system as one that is inclusive of infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. It's universally accessible, it's high quality, it's equitable, and that's important for multiple reasons. Equitable to families and equitable for the workers who are committed to this work, who in large measure are women and increasingly women of color. Affordable, reliable for families. And that's another piece that I hope we get to, because as the economy has changed in the course of this pandemic, I think that there's a certain myth that we want to knock down, which is that, you know, more flexibility to from employers to employees has somehow made childcare less of an issue. The reality is that, you know, now you've got families that are just trying to balance their work life over the course of a 24-hour day and a 7-day schedule. And it's become no less complicated than it was previously. And then finally, it needs to be a world-class system that is sustainable for early childhood education operators. And this was an issue that we had identified before the pandemic. We knew that about 25% of licensed early childhood education programs had closed in the decade before the pandemic. We knew that the early childhood workforce was already in crisis with turnover rates roughly a third annually. And that's certainly not sustainable for any business to operate under. And we knew the cost of care was highest in Massachusetts. Other than the District of Columbia, there was no state that has a higher average cost of care in Massachusetts. And again, these are all costs and burdens that were being absorbed by working families. And to that end, I think there was also a recognition that the workforce has changed over the course of years. In Massachusetts, 70% of children under the age of 6 have all of their parents engaged in the workforce. We know that the impacts are significant on those families. And we know that the competition is fierce right now for skilled labor. And so that's where I think the rubber hits the road in terms of business engagement, is recognizing this as an economic issue and a workforce issue. And there we stand at, at the point we're at in this pandemic, seeing now that 4.3 million workers nationally have left the workforce. In Massachusetts, that's almost 250,000 workers who have left since January of 2020. We see companies that are desperately searching for workers across the state. They cannot find workers. And what I think has really occurred within the employer community is a recognition that there really was a convenient fiction that this system was working well enough for families before and working well enough for employers before. And now, in the stark reality and the harsh light, I think, of this pandemic, it's recognized that that this system really wasn't working well for families previously, and surely is not working well for families during the course of this pandemic. And so we are committed to being advocates in bringing the leadership and the voice of the business community on behalf of state policies and federal policies that will achieve the vision that we have for Massachusetts. We're also engaged in public-private partnership. We helped fund the work that led to the C3 formula, which is being used by Commissioner Sam to deliver the stabilization grants to early childhood education providers. We're engaged in funding workforce development strategies with JBS and the Care Institute and neighborhood villages to continue to pilot and to scale workforce strategies to better source, better train, and better compensate our early childhood educators. And finally, there's a big opportunity for employers themselves to be engaged as actors within this space. There's more that employers could be doing to provide benefits to their employees that relate to childcare, whether that's providing childcare subsidies, forming partnerships with local early childhood education providers, providing resource and referral information to their employees. There's numerous ways in which employers can be part of the solution. And so we really have, I think, a moment in time right now where the employer community stands in recognition of this, long overdue, I might add. And we look forward to being part of the solution, recognizing, by the way, as I said at the beginning, there are countless people who have been involved in this work for many, many years. And so we have a lot to learn. We really stand as partners, and we look forward to working with everyone to make this the moment and to really cross the line here and get it done.
Thanks, Tom. I mean, one thing I'm really confident about in the work that you're leading on, and it's truly important, and I'm so grateful that, you know, that this coalition has been stood up and that you're at the helm of it, is I'm confident you are informing all the work that you do and the information that you're sharing and thinking about with the business leaders. All that is informed by your work in your previous role and by bringing the voice of providers and early education professionals to the table, so that you're really lifting up exactly what you said before, a dynamic that everyone in the early education space already knew about and was grappling with long before the pandemic, even if it's taken some of our chambers or our trade associations or our large employers a little bit more time and the starkness of a pandemic to really reinforce how critically important it is that we start to shift the narrative here.
Thank you, Representative. I would just quickly add to that what you just identified is really the workforce crisis within the workforce crisis, right? Which is we certainly have the challenges that I laid out broadly across the economy, the lack of skilled workers, high demand. I think for the broader employer community, the education has been around the challenges of the early childhood education workforce and understanding that they can't address their own workforce needs until we address the early childhood education workforce issues. Their own employees are not going to be able to find the quality of care or even care options generally, but certainly we must insist that they're quality options if we don't help to solve the issue for early childhood educators. And so I think it's great that you cited that, and certainly the work of this panel and many others, including audience members here, and I know Kathy Gallo was given a shout out earlier, you know, is essential to addressing those issues. Yeah.
So I'm mindful of our time, and I want to have a chance for you all just to sort of free-form dialogue around some of the big themes that have been discussed tonight, as well as many registrants submitted questions in advance. So maybe just to set the stage, I think there are at least 4 topics we could talk about broadly, and perhaps we can spend, you know, 3 to 5 minutes on each one. So just to sort of have ourselves start to frame our, ground ourselves in the agenda, we might take a little bit more time to talk about the policy framework, and I'll explain that a little bit more. Then we might do a little bit more just cross-pollination of thinking on the workforce issues that we've discussed. I heard from a number of registrants, and of course, as a parent like Sharon, Tom, and others on the call, what are we thinking about for our children, including during COVID? What kinds of, what are we seeing in the classrooms? How can families best navigate the system to find a good fit for their children? And then maybe turning back again to this idea of partnerships outside of the early education and care space to businesses, to community organizers, what have you, the larger, broader ecosystem. So maybe we'll start then again with sort of this policy framework. So, we've talked a little bit and we heard from the Congresswoman about some childcare solutions that are being discussed at the state and federal level. What do you see as important in shifting in terms of the legal and financial framework so that we can better support the industry?
I can just start with the funding that has already been approved and allocated to the Department of Early Education and Care, and then gone out to the field, and the stabilization grants, which were originally 6 months and now have been extended for a year, are a really important factor. And then, as Representative Clark mentioned, the federal package that's being worked on, that's a much bigger agenda around childcare, paid family leave, universal preschool, all of these things that we've talked about for years. Really having a chance of making it into a big package is no small feat, both with our delegation from Massachusetts fighting the good fight every day in Washington, D.C., but also being informed by state legislatures, by mayors across the country who are really finding ways to make these investments happen. You did mention the Common Start legislation, and I think that's been another really good rallying cry in Massachusetts to have a comprehensive visionary bill to kind of, put the flag in to say this is what we want for our children. And I know, Representative, you've talked a lot about that sometimes the children get lost in these discussions, but we have to pay attention to what's happening for children If you think for COVID, if you have a 3-year-old, it's been more than half their lifetime that they've been in this. And we've heard this time and time again. So taking these big policies ideas and breaking it down to what it might mean to flexible dollars, to increase compensation, to what Kathleen talked about how are we recognizing our early educators and school age staff, so that when they do make a commitment to this work, that they feel recognized and appreciated, and not just like, well, we'll get to you when we have time. We have to think about over here about these other issues. So I think the policy, we have seen a really incredible feedback loop about what's happening on the ground, and then what does the policy need to look like. And I think as advocates, sometimes we have been hesitant to tell the real story about what's happening. And I think that has changed over the past 18 months.
I think that, Amy mentioned the stabilization funding that we're getting through EEC, and it's been extended to a year. I think there needs to be a commitment, looking 3 years out. I mean, this is not going away. This is a long-term issue that will ultimately, and we're seeing it now, it's affecting every single facet of professional work. We have waiting lists. You're struggling getting staff, but that stabilization money is helping us make sure that at the end of every month, we're balancing our expenses and our revenue. So I don't think a 1-year commitment from the Commonwealth is nearly enough for what we're seeing. I would like to see now an answer now, looking not tonight, obviously, but looking into the future, really, 2, 3, 4, 5 years out, because
Sure.
Like I said, we don't know even the commitment that we're getting for reimbursement rate for next year. And I think it gives us the opportunity to all plan, and our staff are given multiple opportunities all over the place. We want them to stay. And in order for them to stay, we have to pay them a good solid wage in addition to their benefit package. And with that stabilization money, it really helps us. So, I think that is something that I appreciate. The 1 year, not nearly enough.
Right. And you mentioned the planning for the future is one of your big P's. So that's just reinforcing that point. Sharon, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to dovetail on what both Kathleen and Amy said. First, I'll pick up on Amy's piece about children. And I think we have to continue to center our policy and our thinking on children, that children have a right to this kind of quality education development. I mean, thinking about it from that perspective versus, and I think Biden's plans do think about it in this way, but right now we don't think about the children. Head Start does, but the regular childcare funding that comes from Washington thinks about, how much is a parent working, is a parent not working, how many days did the child attend? It's just this nitpicky, sort of things that don't even matter, but they really aren't at the heart of why we're doing this, because the children are our future. And when we talk about businesses and having employees, or we talk about success in K through 12, I mean, we have to start at the earliest time. So I want to echo, or just put a flag up for Amy's comment about centering our policy and making sure we have them at the top of our, or at the forefront. And I think a lot of what comes after that will almost follow or fall into place, because if you value children, then you value the people who teach them, the people who care for them. And what we have right now is it's not valued. I mean, we have to think of a serious investment in salaries, not one time, not $1 an hour, but a shift in where early educators sit on the, when you look at industries, when you look at fields, and when you look at the value of their work, they're not compensated, commensurate with that value. And so again, and children play into that role. So if we believe children are our first priority and are important, then the educators should be there too. It's complex, and that's the challenge. And it's why we've been probably, doing this work for so long. There's so many different levels, so many different funding streams, so many different things that we have to address. I think, but taking one piece at a time, and really, like I said, focusing on children and figuring out how best to support them and the people in their lives, which includes teachers, which includes families, which includes, programs and the like. So, sorry.
Right. No, that's really very well said. And it goes back sort of to the introductory remarks and what I know as a 7th grade teacher and what I know as an attorney who's worked on issues related to K-12 education, and I'm a parent in the K-12 school. We do fund our K-12 system very differently nationwide than we do our early education. We do fund it on a student-centered, approach. Now, granted, there may be, we may be still underfunding there, but at least, we are committing both state, federal, and local dollars to every student who's enrolling in our public schools, which is quite different from the model that we've stood up in our country that's so different from other advanced countries when it comes to students 0 to 5. So maybe we can shift. We've already, I think, all talked a lot about workforce. I do want to just hold up some of the questions that we've heard from registrants about professionalizing the early education field so we can recruit and retain qualified teachers, because certainly a major portion of this is around compensation. There may also be opportunities in which we do more to professionalize with things like paid time off and vacation time. I think that was referenced maybe earlier tonight. Also, perhaps interested in sort of training, ongoing training, on-ramping training for professionals. Also, a little bit of interest that I've heard from registrants in terms of mental health services for our early educators. So any additional thoughts that we would like to spend a few minutes on with respect to workforce?
I guess I would like to, a couple things I would like to see initiated, and that's really self-paced training, self-paced education. I think everything, if we've learned nothing else during the pandemic, technology actually is a friend. I can't believe I'm saying that, but I think, our teachers are parents, they are caregivers. They're working full time. And I think if they had the opportunity to have some self-paced trainings that help to advance them to be a teacher, a lead teacher, I think that would be hugely helpful. I think right now we're stuck in Tuesdays at 5 o'clock till 7 o'clock, and that's not effective for anybody. It's the old way of learning, right? So I think there's people across the state that could really help that. And I do think, you mentioned the public schools, we are up against the public schools. We lose teachers to become paras and pretty consistently. And I think there may be a point where we look at training days and the amount of closings we get, and we expand that a little bit so we can close for an entire week to give our staff a paid week off. Again, they're not getting the 10 weeks that a public school teacher gets, but anything that we can do to improve their experience and so that they really feel valued and they can also balance their family lives. I think we need to look at it. It is a professional field. We rebranded our childcare maybe 4 years ago to Y Academy. We changed the curriculum, we changed the branding, we changed the uniforms, we changed everything about it. And that has changed how we do business with our youngsters and their families. And, I think, and I've heard it from the Y team that they feel like they're more professional now that they're part of something like a Y Academy. And, I think we need to put more dollars into, creative trainings, self-training where people can do it on their self, time off that's not just for mandated training. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that go with that.
And
thanks,
to
Kathleen.
pick up on what Kathleen was saying, one of my roles previously was as president of the governing board for NAUIC, the National Association for the Education of Young Children, which has worked in partnership with national organizations around power to the profession, which is really about professionalizing the field. And I put the link in chat. There is its own kind of website now. It's kind of the creation of its own. And the next step is policies and looking at state legislation about how we really do this. How do we have a career ladder? How do we tie compensation, to credentials and experience, all the pieces. And, you know, my talking point has been like, we can't call childcare essential and have 37% of early educators eligible for some kind of public assistance in Massachusetts. And that was a pre-COVID number. I'm sure it's greater now. But this professionalization is one of the ways that we have to think about supporting our fields. Higher ed, paid time off, all of those pieces that some people take for granted. And just acknowledging that people have been doing this work, you know, when nobody knew how COVID was really being spread, they showed up for families who needed to go to work. You know, and just supporting families around child development and how to look at your developmental milestones. I will say, Rep, the mental health services is something that we keep hearing over and over.
Mhm.
So we need a policy solution for that.
Thank you for confirming that. And also I'm thinking also about just the mental health supports for our young children and children across the spectrum. They've lost a lot. In talking to some of the Y Academy professionals, they acknowledge that there have been, you know, some aggressive behaviors, or children aren't meeting benchmarks because they've been so isolated, or they have dealt with trauma in the home caused by COVID. So that certainly has, you know, kept me up at night, and I'm sure you all as well. I'm mindful that we only have about 5 minutes left, so maybe we could do a round robin with any sort of closing remarks, including if you'd like to touch a little bit more on the employer component of this that, you know, former Commissioner Weber mentioned, that Tom's leading on, or, you know, successful community partnerships you've seen, these public-private partnerships or other community-based organizations. I think we managed to sort of ground our conversation thanks largely to Sharon and really thinking about a child-centered focus. But if there are other ways in which community members who are watching tonight or when they watch the recording can think about advocating for the most vulnerable children whose needs are the greatest, whose voices are often less heard, who come from more marginalized communities or families, so that we can really ground any policy decisions in that frame. So grateful for each of your insights in all of this, and I know we'll be able to keep having conversations past this 1 hour. Do you want to start, Sharon, and we'll then go maybe Sharon, Tom, Kathleen?
I was going to let Tom go because
Okay.
we haven't heard from him for a while, so I was going to be
Good.
quiet.
I felt like I had run long at the beginning, so I was happy to yield back the time. No, thank you. Thanks, Sharon. And thank you, Representative. I think I would like to actually start is picking up on some comments that were made earlier about the stabilization grants in the term that would be appropriate for us to maintain them. The answer is forever. And I think we need to dispense of the sort of deficit mentality where we're grateful for a year or grateful for 3 years. Now, to be fair to the Board of Early Education Care, they can only approve a budget for 1 more year. That was the maximum extent to which they could approve their budget. So they went as far as they could, and it was, I think, a really important step that they took, and I give them credit. But when it comes to our advocacy on this account, the answer is never. We're never going back. We need to maintain these stabilization grants, and by the way, increase them as well, because they were based on the available funds. So they set a percentage for these grants that were based not on need really, but based on the availability of the resources. And so I think we need to look at it in the very same way as you said, Representative, that we look at our K-12 funding. This is basically the beginning of a foundation budget for early childhood education, and we need to continue to advocate on that behalf. And it's going to require additional federal funds, it's going to require additional state funds, and that's where the employer community has to be part of the conversation as well, which is to help to answer the question about where these resources are going to be coming from. If this is a public good, we should be funding it as a public good, and we should be talking about broad-based revenue, including the employer community, to support that kind of work. And I just want to note one last thing, and this brings it back to Sharon's point on the impact on children. Right now, I think I read today actually that 40% of preschool age children are enrolled this year in preschool, and it's down 14 percentage points from where it was last year. And it's the first time since 1996 that fewer than half of preschool age children are enrolled in preschool. So that gives you a really strong sense of the impact that the pandemic is having on this population. And just think what we're going to see based on what you said, Representative, in terms of behavioral health issues, mental health issues for children, and the very
readiness,
kindergarten readiness, and the profession of early childhood educators that are going to be working to try to mitigate these issues. We've got to make deep investments in our workforce development system in order to address that. And it certainly needs to be centered around adequate compensation in order to attract and retain people into this field. So I'll stop there. I think I more than made up my time, Sharon, for whatever what I didn't offer for the prior 10 minutes. Oh, and I would only just say there's lots of things that the employer community can do in partnering with local community partners. The solutions really need to be locally driven. We've seen some really cool stuff. There's a bank called Siemens Bank on the Cape that partners with Cape Cod Children's Place. They basically secure infant, toddler, and preschool seats for their employees at Cape Cod Children's Place. They subsidize those seats 60% of the cost of care, but they subsidize it even if they're empty to provide stability to the program, which continues to keep that resource available to the entire community. I think these are things that we should be looking at as employers and thinking about how we might extend programs like that. And now I'm going to stop.
Great.
And the only thing that I might add now, because I know time is up, is to, as Tom said, not focus on the deficits either. That there's so many strengths in the early childhood field that we don't give ourselves enough credit for. I mean, in fact, you know, we've had a career ladder in our organization for ever since I've been at ABCD. You know, you get more education, you get a promotion, you get more responsibility. There is a career ladder, but we haven't been recognized as a profession. And there's a lot of reasons. I think we won't go into those. Female, of color, you know, being some of the factors that kind of, I think folks have been reluctant to call us a profession, even when we've done some professional things. But I think that there's so many strengths, including, as we said, during COVID, our community, our early childhood teachers, family childcare providers, we were holding it together. We were holding families together. We were holding businesses together. And those strengths really need to be, you know, sort of elevated and shouted from the rooftops, because there's a lot to build on and celebrate in the early childhood community.
I love that as almost a final thought, unless Amy or Kathleen want to add anything else. But I love both. I'm taking away from Tom's point, we should never go back, right? That this needs to be a forever moment, and we have to figure out how to make sustainable investments moving forward. And I appreciate also, Sharon, that despite all of the challenges we're talking about, there have been real strengths all along the way, including now, and we need to really learn from that and hold that up as well.
And I just want to simply close by saying this can't wait. This, you know, this needs to be a priority. And, you know, nights like tonight, we need to keep pushing ahead and not get lost in the shuffle.
I think then as well for that's a charge to anybody who's listening tonight to be in touch with your representatives. So I look forward to many emails coming my way from my district, but across the Commonwealth, letting your representatives know both at the state and federal level, as well as, you know, local leaders, that this is really important to you for many different reasons. I want to just also, before we close, let folks know who are watching that on my website, I have put together a number of existing programs and policies at the state and federal level that may be of relevance to you and your families. This has been such a challenging time over the last 19 months and continuing. So you can find, you know, information about housing security, food security, your personal well-being, all on my website. And I'll also switch quickly to show the slides of contact information for the panelists. If you don't have time to jot these down now, you know, email me and I will be happy to put you in touch with this esteemed panel, who I am, again, so honored to have learned from tonight. Really appreciate your time and your commitment to this critical issue. So I think we'll end there. I hope that everyone who's here tonight or who is watching later stays well and safe. And I look forward to working with you in partnership to continue to elevate early education and childcare to move toward a new paradigm that supports all children in the Commonwealth and the nation, and getting a healthy, great start to life. So be well and take care. Thank you again.
Thank you.